You have to share.
I was like, all right, you got it. Tell me at least like one thing.
Oh no, it's not that one though. It was on my Chrome, I think. Hold on, but I just switched it.
I don't think your computer is saying that it's connected either. Because otherwise it would have done something funky.
Is it sharing? Share my.
Nice. Have you pressed the map button on the switch?
Yeah.
Okay.
More than once.
Okay.
Back and forth.
That's
Is
what
that
people always
sharing
forget.
that?
No, we've been doing it. I was thinking moving it to a different input to see if that.
Is it?
Because you don't see it as a. You go to
I'm
like
gonna see it.
displays, you don't see it. It doesn't come up as a.
It says you're sharing Google, and it looks like I'm sharing this, right? It looks like.
That's sharing online. That's not going to the. That's not showing that it's going to the slide. Okay. Which I don't. Signal status off. So it's not getting anything. Let's. Is it even showing that?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if people are actually seeing my. I don't know, maybe I should ask you.
Okay, so it does show that.
It does show that. Okay.
So it may be this, it may be the double, as I said, sometimes the double.
Oh, the double
really?
thing.
Double,
Oh, okay.
double things can, I have one in my eye.
Can I
Yes.
try this one?
Yes. Well,
Yeah, 'cause you can
I
put
need to
both.
unplug them. Oh, I can put
Well,
power
yeah,
through?
yes.
Okay. I just have one side.
Oh, okay.
The other one has both. But...
So plug that there. Yes,
And then-
there or there. Oh yeah, it's up here.
Oh, not short end. Hold on, so this is some zero. That's on Mac, right?
Mac.
Oh, you know what?
Get out of here. So
Yeah.
stop.
Still not seeing it. Why is that?
Oh, it's already, yeah.
And then there will.
So when you, oh, but it doesn't take it at all.
Yeah, it's not.
It
It is.
It's gonna be 40 degrees by porch.
Try something.
That's like another 33% farther away.
So I think these messages are saying they'll have my name on it for some reason, but I don't know what's going on.
Did you do the screen
Hmm?
to get it projected? Did you do the display setting?
The display setting.
Put the sent number through, see if that.
Figure
Hold on, where's the setting?
I don't just put in display, go in applications. Yeah, there you go. And it's something like displays on my version. Yeah. E displays.
Can we try a different computer?
Yeah, we can try
It's
that.
online, so
Mine has an
What
option.
kind
where
of
I have to
connection
share.
do you have? Do you have? You just have.
Hmm?
We're going to try Jan's computer, see if it.
Okay.
If it's.
were you able to access the presentation before I have access to it? No.
So now I need access to your presentation.
Well, first let's see if it.
Let's see if we get there.
It should have.
Let me try just the one
Oh.
random.
It's probably just like
For a second, I thought it had something.
And technically, I don't need the slides, to be honest. So we could also go without slides.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can just go ahead and, I mean, the slides are just images.
And we can email them.
So it's not,
Yeah, and
it's not picking yours
It's
up
not
either.
picking
John.
mine. Okay, so
So-
something strange.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can go with the slides.
Yeah.
let's do that. We can go with the slides. This is strange.
Yeah, very weird.
How do I do it? Do I put my laptop here? So.
Yeah, you can pick it up.
So it must be this one.
It could be that. I have another adapter.
Well, I'm glad that I wasn't planning to have slides.
I have another adapter and we could.
Yeah, let's just start. So we can say a couple of words and then we can start.
Of course.
Are you on WebEx?
I believe so. I'm on WebEx, right?
But you'll be okay. But you are sharing online.
Yeah.
So you can flip through your.
Yeah.
Your online.
I was doing that earlier,
Just for this audience.
Yeah. Yeah.
so I can show the slides here then. Okay. So they get a better experience now.
That's right.
You get a better experience online.
All right, everyone, thank you for coming to the brown bag. Thank you for coming to the brown bag. We have a mixed brown bag in person and on WebEx. People on WebEx will have a better experience because they see the slides. But
Well, no. They're gonna have a different experience. You're having a better experience because it's live.
right, it's no better. It's just different. So Julio has prepared this regardless of the slides anyway, independent of the slides. So first, are there any announcements before we start? No announcement. Okay, our guest today is Julio Mateo. He's an ex-student in our program, and he was kind enough to come back and share some of his experiences. So without further ado, Julio, take it away.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you. Hi, Corey. Thank you. I want to thank Deb for inviting me to speak. I want to thank all of you for being here online. I have to confess that for years I've actually avoided coming back to this building because of the shame that I carry from never having finished my dissertation. So I've been ABD for over 10 years now, but a lot has changed in my life in the past few years, including some serious personal growth and some increased self-awareness and a new perspective on human factors and actually on my dissertation too. So I'm extremely excited to be back and share some of my experiences with you today. And maybe you can help me re-engage with my dissertation and hold me accountable to get it done soon. So this is going to be an unusual brown bag, I think. It's kind of an experiment to me too. I plan to spend the next hour first sharing 3 different personal stories, and then I just would like to open it up to some discussion. So the stories touch on activism, human factors education, and the intersection of the two. I hope to talk for about 30 minutes at most, and then have extra time, probably less than 30 minutes now, but to have a discussion. And I hope that you join me in the discussion. So anybody has any questions and comments so far? All right. In November of 2018, the then Assistant Chief of Police at the City of Dayton, Matt Carper, delivered a presentation to the Dayton Community Police Council. He said that he wanted to share he wanted to share information with community members about this new technology that the police department was considering acquiring. It was a gunshot detection technology called ShotSpotter. Basically, it involved an array of microphones installed around an area, in this case, Northwest Dayton. The system was designed to respond to loud noises that had sound profiles similar to gunshots. When a potential gunshot was detected, the recording was sent to a control room in which human operators reviewed the sound and determine whether it was in fact a gunshot, and when possible, what type of firearm it might have originated from. The microphone array was then used to triangulate the signal to see where it originated from. When operators determined the sound was indeed a gunshot, dispatch sent a shots fired notice to officers with its approximate location. Per policy, 2 officers would be dispatched to the location to respond and investigate. At the presentation, Assistant Chief Carper showed some promotional videos from the company and told us that currently about 80% of shots fired go unreported because nobody calls them in. And even when people call them in, sometimes the neighbors have a hard time identifying where it originated. So ShotSpotter could actually help police respond faster with more precise location information, and it will also give them the ability to respond to shots fired, even at times when neighbors did not call them in. And he argued that this technology would increase, responsiveness from police and increase community-police relations, and then open it up to the members of the council, so I was one of them, to see if any community members had any feedback. Now, I had never heard of ShotSpotter before this presentation. And to be honest, the way it was presented sounded good to me. The only question I had was what happens when the officer is sent to a location by error for a shots fired alert? So I asked about false alarms and what data they had about the rate of false alarms of the system. The answer I received was basically that the system is virtually perfect, that it never makes mistakes, that it catches all the shots fired and never miscategorizes a shot as that is not a gunshot, it's a gunshot. So at this point, it was clear to me that what they were telling us was just not possible. But the truth is that I didn't have any data to argue with them at the time or to disprove their claims. So this is what I said. When I was in grad school, I was part of the signal detection laboratory, which studies exactly these types of situations in which the goal is to distinguish signals from noise. I can tell you that based on what you shared, it's just not possible, that the system is able to detect all the hits while avoiding all the false alarms. So either it doesn't catch all the gunshots or it sometimes claims to detect gunshots that aren't so. So let us establish that there has to be at least some false alarms. And you asked us what concerns the community might have with this technology. One concern I could envision is related to officers being dispatched being dispatched on a shots fired call when no shots have been fired, especially how accurate you claim this technology to be. I'm concerned that officers might arrive in high alert and with inaccurate information and erroneously identify a resident that generated the noise or somebody else who's in the area as the potential active shooter. And maybe there's a black guy with a dark cell phone or a toy gun or something else in their hand at that location where the alleged gunshot happened. Now, for context, for some of you who might not be aware, just a few years earlier in 2014, a Beaver Creek police officer had killed John Crawford III, a 22-year-old at the Walmart just across the street from here. The shopper had called 911 to report an armed individual, quote unquote, pointing a gun at people in the store, a potential active shooter situation. Officers came into the store and approached the area where John Crawford was with weapons drawn. They yelled a command to drop the weapon, and almost immediately shot him dead as he reacted startled to the unexpected loud command. As it turns out, the weapon was a toy gun that Crawford had picked up from a shelf at the Walmart store, and he was carrying it with him as he wandered around the store. By the time the officers yelled at him, he was on the phone with the mother of his 2 children. The incident drew national attention and was investigated by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney General. They concluded that the officer that killed Crawford had not violated any federal civil rights laws. The rationale was that given what the officer knew at the time and the totality of circumstances, which included the 911 call with inaccurate information about an armed individual pointing the gun at people, that the officer did not intend to deprive Crawford of his civil rights. The family of John Crawford did get a settlement from Beaver Creek, and they're still litigating with Walmart to this day. A few months later, also in 2014, and also in Ohio, Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy, was killed while carrying a replica toy gun in a park in similar circumstances in Cleveland. So as I was saying, I didn't actually pass the slides, so they're still in my first slide. That's okay. 1 second, sorry. So as I was saying, I told Assistant Chief Carper that one of the concerns I could envision was related to police officers being dispatched on a shots fired alert with inaccurate information and potentially mistaken a resident with something in their hand as an active shooter. Now, knowing what I just shared with you, what would you do?
In terms of, well, I certainly investigate how good the system is rather than just take their company's word for it.
Yeah.
It's false alarms are important. In this case, false alarms can have deadly circumstances.
So I'll be honest, I didn't do much right away. We had a discussion. We wrapped the meeting, and I didn't think much about it for months. But when I read in the paper that the city had decided to acquire and implement shot spotter without answering any of the questions, and that the commission that made the decision had not been informed of any issues, I did take it upon myself to do more research on it. So right away, I found out that the technology wasn't so new, and while the company was very protective of its data, there was some independent studies suggesting that 30 to 70% of shot spotter dispatches were what they call dead-end deployments, which are not exactly false alarms, but are times when officers are sent to location of an alleged gunshot and they find no evidence of a gunshot. They claim that that's because they just couldn't find the shells, but I mean, it still creates the same situation that we were talking about earlier. At the time, we didn't have any Dayton-specific data, but eventually we learned that those percentages were very similar in Dayton, actually close to 70%. For the next 3 years, I advocated with others for the cancellation of shot spotter in Dayton in a variety of ways, including spearheading petitions, conversations with commission members, conversation with police command staff, public comments, writing, engaging with the press and the public, and so on. And I'm pleased to inform you that last month, the city of Dayton finally canceled shot spotter. So that's the first story. I'm sorry about the slides. I'm not keeping up. So we can have a short discussion if anybody wants to talk about this for like 5 minutes or anything. Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, a false positive. So very neat. And what have you seen on the, like, you know, when you dangerous?
Yeah, so I think what I would say in terms of this specific technology is that when there is a gunshot situation where there is injured people, they usually get called in, you know, like, so the ones that are most critical are detected. ShotSpotter actually, probably the one benefit that I can see ShotSpotter having is when there is a potentially critically injured person, they could reduce the response time because it sends people earlier. And so that would be one situation in which I actually think ShotSpotter could be helpful.
It may even improve localization.
Could improve localization, yeah. So there are, I'm not saying there's no benefits to ShotSpotter. I'm just saying what it also does, so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but what it also does is it sends a lot of the police force on high alert or high priority calls, 2 officers at a time, on calls where they get absolutely nothing. So it actually completely drains resources from the police to be able to respond to like calls from citizens for other things. But answering, I mean, I hear like, I mean, it'd be bad, like it's bad to miss gunshots that do happen, but most of the situations in which there's something, you know, serious, like high priority happening, there's almost always 911 calls with them. So the ones that they catch that 911 calls would not catch are usually, you know, not, I mean, they frame the technology as 80% of the time, nobody calls gunshots. And then when you apply the technology, 70% of the time you go to a place, you don't find anything. So it's almost like, what's the technology helping you do, right?
I think in this case, false negatives are hard to come by. Because a false negative in this case is that ShotSpotter would not report a shot. And therefore, if someone called in that there was a shot, they could refer to ShotSpotter, like, did it pick everything up? And no, it didn't. But my guess is that's really not how they were using that technology. Although they could use that way, and that would give you a false negative, perhaps. But it could have been the car backfiring, right? And since this technology is comparing the frequency profile, the spectral profile of the sound against sort of gunshot, while to us, a car backfire might sound like a gunshot, the details may not fit a gunshot spectral profile very well.
So one thing I'll say that I learned much later, I learned last year, right before they canceled it through an organization that has a website called Cancel ShotSpotter, is that the contract that they signed with the city, this has to do with the criterion, right, in signal detection theory. The contract they signed with the city guarantees the city that if there is they are going to catch at least 90% of the gunshots that happen. Doesn't say anything about false alarms. So they have a commitment, a guarantee that they are going to catch at least 90% of the gunshots, which in itself is, like, if they have false alarms, nothing happens. But if they don't catch gunshots, they actually violate their contract. So,
And that might be no more than, we will detect all the loud sounds. We guarantee we'll catch loud sounds. Some of those will be gunshots.
So yeah, so I don't have the contract here, but actually I probably have a copy of that in the contract because somebody else caught it and shared it with us. So, all right, I'm gonna move on to the next story so I can go through the story. We can have hopefully more time at the end. So, my next story is about my dissertation proposal. Okay. Actually, the people online already knew because I already had it. So in the fall of 2003, I joined the Signal Detection Laboratory, as I mentioned before, with Gilkey as my academic advisor. For my master's, I did research on how feedback delays impact performance on a target acquisition task in a virtual environment. While working in the lab, I also conducted research on spatial or tactile displays at the auditory localization facility, the Sphere, at the base. In 2006, I became an IGER Fellow in Technology-Based Learning with Disability, an interdisciplinary program funded by the National Science Foundation that Wright State had just started at the time. It was through my involvement with the IGER program, that I did some super interesting research, if I may say so, on gaze interaction, exploring approaches to support users so that they can control computers and communication devices using only their eyes. When it came time to prepare my dissertation proposal, I wanted to do something that was related to spatial auditory displays, since that was Gilkey's area of expertise. But I also needed to choose research with application to disability and technology. So the most obvious choice was to focus on blind navigation. Specifically, how could spatial auditory displays be leveraged to support blind pedestrians during travel? While I was researching the topic, I encountered an organization called the National Federation of the Blind, which is basically an organization of blind people by blind people. They were very critical of technological aids to support blind travelers, and they claimed that skilled blind people could travel fine and needed no technology. The National Federation of the Blind had also developed an alternative approach to training blind navigation that was different from traditional mainstream orientation mobility programs. Their approach emphasized the importance of instilling confidence in their blind students, empower them to believe they could do anything a sighted person can do, and also emphasize the importance of role models. Instead of instructors teaching students to travel around their house and at their work or school, their training schools were residential. Students spent months in a different location from the one where they lived, learning blindness skills like computer skills, how to cook, how to travel around, and then they went back to their homes and applied those skills they gained where they lived, worked, and played. But perhaps the most interesting difference between mainstream orientation and mobility and this training approach, for my purposes, was that travel instructors were not required to be sighted. In fact, being blind was in many ways considered better because they could more easily serve as a role model and convey to students that they also could live independent lives without vision. So I became fascinated with this organization and this group of expert blind travelers. And I was wondering, how did they travel independently, and did they really need no technology? Virtually all of the other research looking at navigation aids make it sound like blind travelers needed technology in order to travel independently. Many of them acknowledge that blind people would also use other tools like a cane or a dog and orientation and mobility skills, but the navigation aids were typically not built to augment what travelers were already doing, and instead, sorry. And for the most part, blind travelers were seen as passive agents that relied on technology to guide them. As I was preparing my dissertation proposal, I also knew that I was expected to conduct an experimental study. So I designed an experiment in which we could compare different displays as participants, we could compare different displays as participants, blind and sighted, move through a simulated environment. I also told my committee that before conducting my experiment, I would need to better understand how blind people travel successfully without vision, because there wasn't much information out there, so I could design the simulated environment and displays accordingly. So I proposed conducting a cognitive task analysis with some of the expert blind travelers in Reston, Louisiana, through a connection I had made with Dr. Eddie Bell from Louisiana Tech University. I must have made a really strong case for how important the need to understand successful travel without vision was, because my committee recommended that I just expand my cognitive task analysis and focus on that for my dissertation. I'd already designed, conducted, and published several experimental studies by that point in my graduate education, so my dissertation committee, my committee members did not doubt my ability to design and conduct experiments. But it was clear to my committee and to me that developing a model that captured how expert blind travelers can successfully navigate their environment without vision would provide a much bigger contribution to the field of navigation aids and would help blind people more than any experiment comparing spatial displays without this understanding. So that's what I did. I conducted dozens of sessions with a group of expert blind travelers, most of which also were or had been travel instructors. I interviewed them using a critical decision method. I conducted think aloud protocol sessions with them. I observed lessons in which they were teaching and monitored other blind students. And I even received a few training sessions as a student myself under blindfold. It was quite an eye-opening experience, pun totally intended. I gained an understanding for exactly what they meant when they said that they could travel without technological aids. I learned an incredible amount about the non-visual information they use during travel, how they use the cane and car traffic to stay oriented, the cognitive strategies they use, etc. I learned how important the naturally occurring behavior of other people around them was to blind travelers. It wasn't that they couldn't use technology to augment what they did. It was that most technologists never care to ask them what they do and how they can support them. And most of the solutions technologists build disregarded the skills that were so critical for them to have an independent life. My research focused primarily on developing and refining a framework to understand how successful travel without technology took place. And I also learned quite a bit about how technology could enhance their independence and be embraced by expert travelers. Now, when I was working on my dissertation, I did not see my research as a work of activism. I still don't, really. But looking back, I can see similarities between this experience and the experience I've had during my activism. In many other situations we encounter in our community, it is also often people in power making decisions for others in the community without understanding their experience of what they want or what they need. I didn't see my dissertation proposal defense an attempt to advocate for giving blind people a voice in how technology is developed for them. But in hindsight, I can see how my dissertation work was an early form of my community activism, of choosing to do the right thing instead of doing what is expected or following the path of least resistance. I picked up my dissertation back a few times in the past several years, and so far, I've not been able to finish it, even though I am so incredibly close. So I think this realization might be what I needed to pick it up and wrap it up. That's the end of my second story. A very vulnerable story. So again, if anybody has any comments or questions or reactions, I'm happy to engage for a little bit.
So, before I came to Wright State, from 1989 to 1995, I worked at a place in San Francisco called the Smith Kettlewell Eye Research Institute. In that institute, there is a group, there still is a group, called RARC, and I don't remember what those acronyms stand for, but when I explained it, it would become clear. So when I was there, this group was dedicated to creating technology to help blind people navigate. And interestingly, half of that group were blind themselves. And so at this institute, which is just a research institute, I would get in at like 7 o'clock in the morning and no one would be there primarily till 10. Just the way academics, they don't have to teach. I think that's the way they work. But several of these blind engineers were there. And so I'd be going down the hallway, past this room, no lights on. But I see someone in there, and here is, blind engineer soldering circuit boards. And I'm like, holy cow, how does that happen? They clearly can do things. Interesting. So they were doing things. One of the things they came up with was something called talking signs. It was basically, they had transmitters mounted on lamp posts at intersections around San Francisco. And they would have a receiver. And when they would get to the corner, it would actually tell them what the cross streets were. That's pretty helpful, right? Because that's something that they're not going to be able to pick up. They can't. But interestingly, these same blind engineers said something very similar to what you said. My colleague that I continue to work with there, sort of wanted to do something, use some technology to make something he was going to call a vibrating, which was going to actually have a sensor and vibrate to tell you how close you were to some obstacle. And he told this idea to some blind, like, we don't need that. We do just fine with arcade, right? Essentially, that's not the kind of technology that's going to be helpful. That arcane does just fine. I mean, we don't run into things. Yeah. So the idea of finding out how they navigate and what they use, I think and how they see what they're doing is really important, because when we look at them, we imagine, we do so much better, but in reality, might not. The other thing that I want to mention, something that an ophthalmologist at the institute, I was there. I go back every year to still work there. This was probably in about maybe 8 years ago. A bunch of ophthalmologists there, eye surgeons and stuff. And he gave a talk, and his realization was like, people come to us, we measure their acuity with these eye charts and things, and we're helping people who have various visual dysfunctions. But maybe we should ask them, maybe we should worry about not just acuity, but can we make your life better? And they thought this was an amazing insight. Like, oh my gosh, isn't that what MDs are supposed to be doing, trying to make your life better? So it also just goes to show that sometimes we get hung up on thinking more about the way that we test things and how well do you do on the test, rather than saying, the more applied question is, how can I make your life better? How can I make your interactions in everyday life better? And I think it's sort of the same thing. It's like you can introduce technology, but if it doesn't somehow contribute to making what the way you get around and make your life better, then it's probably not very useful. So I think that's sort of in line with what your realization and how technology often isn't addressing that. It's like looking from the outside.
Yeah, and even human factors where you're supposed to be focus on the user, we often come with some sort of preconceived notion of what technology we're trying to fit into the problem. So,
right.
Anybody else has any comments or questions or reactions or criticisms or? I hope so. I don't know. I am definitely. I honestly, preparing for this made me go back to this. And John Flack, actually, I shared some of what I was going to talk about, and he kind of, suggested talking about the proposal, which I hadn't thought about. So for me, it's like linking my dissertation to what I'm doing now, which I think makes me more motivated than it was. So,
Have to figure it.
I know. All right. So my third story, and we should have still probably about 15 minutes at least at the end to have a more extensive discussion. It's about what I call my activation. So how I was activated, I guess. So when I moved downtown Dayton in 2015, I wasn't involved in any community organization. Shortly after I moved in 2016, I started getting engaged with an initiative called Start Downtown, which was trying to develop an ecosystem for entrepreneurs in downtown Dayton. And shortly after that, I joined the team behind the Longest Table, which sought to connect Dayton residents by getting them to break bread and hold conversations together. After that, my social commitments escalated quickly, and including nonprofit boards, county and city boards, task forces, and other volunteering, including the Dayton Community Police Council, which I mentioned earlier. Now, the council consisted of about 10 community members who met monthly with a handful of city officials, including the police chief. The council also hosted opportunities for community and police to engage, recommended changes to improve community police relations, and whenever there was an incident affecting community police relations in the city, the council met and we discussed it and tried to find ways to resolve or to address it. Now, if anybody asked me before 2020 whether I was an activist, and some people did, I would tell them no, just an engaged community member. I am not an activist. Some people would have did consider that I was already doing activism. But I didn't see it that way. I saw it as kind of serving others. I was lending my experiences, my skills, my expertise to advance community efforts that others had initiated and were leading. I would advise the city or county officials or provide input into nonprofit boards in response to requests from others. But I did not see myself as holding any responsibility for the decisions or actions that were taken, and I'd push sometimes and try to persuade other public officials when I thought they were making the wrong decisions and when they didn't do what they said they would do. But I did not think it was my role to hold them accountable, and I didn't attempt to do so. At the time, in 2020, I was the co-chair of the community police. Oh, sorry, I skipped it. So I didn't attempt to hold them accountable. That is until the week of May 30th of 2020, when Dayton held its first rally to protest the murder of George Floyd. After the rally, a spontaneous march formed in downtown Dayton. Demonstrators marched peacefully through downtown until a barricade of police officers stopped them and demanded that they disperse. Eventually, Dayton police released tear gas and pepper balls on protesters. Many were arrested for failing to disperse, including some friends of mine. The Community Police Council coordinator attempted to negotiate with officers in the front line, but he was not listened to and resigned that weekend. At the time, I was the co-chair of the Community Police Council, Chief Beal being the other co-chair. Community members were outraged at the actions of the Dayton police officers toward protesters, on top of the national outrage that all of us felt toward the murder of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer. After having sat and meeting month after month with police command staff reassuring us of how much they value community police relations, I felt betrayed. I was outraged. But I still thought the council would meet and work to address the situation, and I thought that city leadership would put pressure on the police to fulfill this obligation. Instead, we encountered a city leadership actively working to prevent community members from speaking freely, obstructing the council meeting, and protecting the police from having to implement any changes. The more we pushed for a council meeting, the more it felt like the city official were trying to silence us. It hadn't become apparent to me until that week, when I got caught between politicians trying to save face and a unified community that was demanding change, that this is what had been happening all along. All along, we had been asked to volunteer hundreds of hours to engage the community, respond to critical events, propose recommendations, and sometimes we'd have a heated discussion like the one we had with ShotSpotter. But while engaging in the process gave them legitimacy, I realized that our input and our work was not impacting any decisions. I realized that regardless of my intent, sitting at those tables and engaging in discussions without demanding any accountability, I was being complicit in perpetuating the same systems that I was wanting to change. After the week of May 30th, I didn't leave the Community Police Council. I still sat at the table with the police command staff month after month. I even signed up and volunteered hundreds of hours for over a year and a half supporting the new police reform effort that the city has spearheaded after George Floyd protests. But my attitude and behavior at those tables was forever changed. I also began engaging in a lot of other actions and other groups outside those tables. And I engaged in actions that I had never engaged before, including initiating petitions to demand changes, participating in protests, organizing community events, obtaining, reviewing, and publishing public records, engaging with the press, joining activist coalitions, campaigning for political candidates, writing opinion pieces in the paper, etc. Becoming activated did come at a price, though. For a while, I had a hard time reconciling my identity as a community activist and my identity as a human factors scientist. I think one reason was that I felt like taking a strong stand and having a clear perspective on what is right or wrong. For example, being certain that the current system are flawed and we need new, better design system, somehow compromise my ability to remain neutral and open when engaging in inquiry as a scientist. Another reason was that after some year working in human factors, I think I had confused what human factors scientists do with what human factors is. In other words, I define what human factor research is based on what human factor researchers get funded to do. But I don't see that conflict anymore. I now see that conducting research to build new systems that create justice, democracy, public safety, etc., is just applied research, like the Wright brothers experimenting to build a flying machine that didn't exist yet, or NASA conducting research to build a spaceship or to go to the moon or to Mars. In all cases, you're just doing research to build systems that don't exist now. Especially, so human factors and especially cognitive systems engineering is a great foundation for conducting the type of work that we need to design better systems that serve us all. Today, I work as a cognitive systems engineer by day, and I see the work I do as helping me develop the skills that I can use to more effectively impact systems and affect systemic change. All of you in human factors or industrial organizational psychology are gaining skills to design better systems. You will have the credibility, status, and persuasion skills to advocate for better systems. And you will likely be building them for corporations, governments, and so on. I would encourage you to also leverage your skills to help design better systems for justice, democracy, public safety, and peace. Even if it doesn't pay to do so, and even if those who are paying your salary are not particularly interested in transforming the system that give them power. That's the end of my third story. And I would like to open a discussion, reactions, comments. It doesn't need to be about what I said. It could also be about my work. Somebody else. Go ahead.
What were some of the toughest challenges you faced transitioning from the program into the job?
So when I transitioned from the program to the job field was I went straight to working on an ongoing Army project. It's a completely different environment when it comes to, customers. I mean, here your customers in a way are your committee. Over there, your customer in this case is the Army or so just customer relations was something that I don't think we learned a lot about. Proposal writing was something that definitely you learn on the job. There were a lot of similarities, but I also went into a company that was a natural decision making company that focused on a lot of knowledge solicitation and interviewing techniques. So I was glad that I had that experience in my dissertation. But for most people going from the program at the time to a job like that, you would basically be asked to do things that you like when it comes to that specific domain, like oftentimes we didn't do during grad school. It was more focused on experimental stuff. And if it hadn't been because of what happened with the dissertation proposal, I probably would have had to do my first interview while I was there. And it happened that my first interview I was actually by myself, even though usually you have a second interviewer. So that would have been probably the most challenging. So I don't know if that answers the question.
But probably not insurmountable.
It's not insurmountable.
Right.
No.
I think one thing that's true is you're learning develop skills, right? You have a lot of tools when you're in grad school. But when you go out into the working world, I pretty much can guarantee you're going to be asked to use those tools in situations and in domains that you never did in grad school. I mean, that's just the fact, because there are too many domains for us to be able to do that. And so we don't even try. What we do is try and give you the tools. And then when you go out in the industry, you're gonna, it's a constant learning thing. This is why, it's actually it's fun, but you're gonna be applying what you know to new situations all the time. And every situation, every domain has its unique characteristics. You're going to have to navigate that. And that's just sort of part of it.
So one thing I would say, so I was reflecting on my comment that the committee is your customers, right? So so obviously that's not the only customer, right? So you have the research you're trying to do and trying to advance science, which is really your customer. But then you have the customer, like the committee, which has to approve your work or professor. That dynamic is definitely plays also in industry. And I think when you come from academic environment, like oftentimes you're less on the applied side or building product and more on the understanding and navigating, like the back and forth with customers and the pressures of producing something and the understanding. And again, I know you're more on the IO side, but in the human factors consistent engineering area, definitely there is a lot of that like we want to understand and how to navigate that balance between the want and need to understand and the fact that you feel this understanding is important. And in academic settings, you're trying to find the right answer, and in industry settings, you're trying to add value to the customer, even if it's an answer that is valuable, that adds value. Yeah. So that mindset is definitely different, especially when you come from a dissertation and you have been spending a lot of time, digging really deep into things, like being able to do things and be comfortable with like doing things half-assed or like whatever that feel that way because you're not going all the way as much as you think you would need to really do the best job you can do.
And that's partly defined right by the fact that you have, well-defined time parameters out in industry, right? It's like, I'm going to give you have 3 months, we want an answer, right? I mean, whereas, we don't currently say, all right, you got 6 months, have that dissertation on it. So there are time pressures also work against getting that deep understanding, but getting to an answer that will make them, whatever it is, put them in a better place than they are now.
And for a human factors background, like most people go into government or into industry or into academia, the answer to your question depends on which one you go to. So I'm answering from an industry standpoint. If you go into government, sometimes you're actually assessing proposals that come in and figuring out, and you have no experience in the field, and that's a challenge in many cases. And if you're in academia, it's a little more similar to the type of job you're doing, but you have other responsibilities you didn't have as a grad student, probably. I don't know. That's probably a question for them.
See kind of factors becoming more in issues like this. So, like, what do you think gap is in grad school that?
So I appreciate that question. So I think the short answer is yes, slightly. Like there is definitely some. I actually Googled some stuff when I was preparing for this on like human factors and community activism. There's a few, outliers out there like doing that. The other aspect answering your question is, people like Don Norman, like with Design X and humanity-centered design. So there is definitely a move in that direction by some influential, I don't know, like even with Don Norman. So it's a very well known, kind of almost like a father of like the more cognitive systems engineering and usability stuff. Where one, anyways, the design, like, but he's one very established figure that wrote the design of everyday things, like back in the 80s, and it was like a seminal book to popularize some of the concepts of human factors. And he's moving into, like, we need to move beyond, the users and the domains, and move about how do we design so for humanity. So, and he has a bit like a loud voice, so that's good. I think in terms of the field, there's always, it feels like there's always resistance, right? So there is the current system and how it operates and how it's funded and who funds it. And I think the challenge for me is how to, create a sustainable humanity-centered design and who's paying for it. Because I think most of the funding sources that I've experienced are not necessarily trying to transform the systems, like they are mostly trying to support them. So,
Would you say, and I have a specific example. So with regards to your being on the police council and bring up this question about what is this, shot spotter, really what you're asking for, let's give me more data. You're giving me a sales pitch, but
yes.
give me data. And so do you see that the structures like the police force, government in general, is often is not seeking data. They're really going based on, opinions, and they're, and then they just propagate. So when they see something that they like for whatever reason, then they're going to propagate that almost, with very little data, some data that they're going to try to convince, but they're really not interested in having the complete data set. They just want, sort of like, they just want the one that justifies what they want.
Yes, 100%.
And they don't like it. So we had a student, former student, who actually was on a city council, human factors guy, city council of a nearby city. And that was the approach he took. So they would bring proposals and he'd be like, okay, hold on, we need to, check this out, more data. And ultimately he had to, after maybe 6 years on council, he stepped down because they were basically enraged. And he was
can
now
relate.
he was now being ostracized because he wasn't just going by, what your opinion is. It's like, let's get data, let's make this data driven. And they really did not like that.
So,
I mean, and even because I've asked another how to do certain state by state. So like the state of Washington, juvenile justice stuff is way stronger and more research based. But even on the council level, it's taught to do metrics or statistics. It's always satisfy the minimum requirement of, and it's definitely more about sales than it is.
absolutely.
That's how they teach it. Okay.
How they teach it in business, public administration.
It's
Yes.
going to be more about, you should have facts, but it's really more about sales.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter.
And that's, yes, 100%. And it's very obvious over time. So I mean, the first time you're in one of these councils, like ShotSpotter was one of the first times this happened to me. But I mean, after that, it was very consistent. I mean, it's always a presentation that is very one-sided. And sorry, so I have two thoughts on that, and I don't want to go into too far of a tangent, but one of them is how frustrating it is to be data-driven when they don't have the same rules, right? Yeah. So they can say they have a bigger megaphone and more legitimacy than a community member on a board, and they are not presenting a balanced view. And then it's really challenging. So this is a question I would pose as a scientist, because this was also giving me a lot of conflict, which is our goal is to help the community understand, what the truth about this situation is. What's the best way to accomplish that if this agency, or whatever you want to call it, is presenting only one side? Is it to present a balanced side or is it to present the other side, right? I mean, how do you contribute to the public understanding the truth of the situation? And that has been really challenging for me, because the way I see it is there is an information ecosystem and is dominated by the government sharing information that the press amplifies. And then most of the people in the community don't really have space for that. And the critics or the scientists don't really have a megaphone. So and whenever a scientist speaks, they are going to say things like what I said with ShotSpotter. Actually, I can see the benefits of ShotSpotter. And that alone completely nullifies my argument in the eyes. So because now I'm acknowledging there is something good, but they would not acknowledge there's anything bad. They would not acknowledge there's any false alarm.
They sound big.
And most of the people in the public are going to put more weight on what the figures of authority, legitimate figures that know about the field say, than about this resident of downtown Dayton with background in human factors says, which what's human factors anyways, like, like, I mean, so when the press reports on it, they center the voice of the government and they legitimize it, and then I'm the critic or the people who dissent, and then it's like the government says this, but but Julio Mateo, this activist, like thinks that, and it completely nullifies the argument. So again, I'll stop there. But one of my frustration has been is like how, I mean, our goal is the truth, right? And our goal is that people actually see a balanced picture of the truth. If nobody is presenting this critical view, it feels very uncomfortable for a scientist not to provide balance, right? It's very uncomfortable to actually present a one-sided view. But if you don't present a one-sided view, you're actually hindering your ability to give the public, a balanced view. So that's the question I'll pose there. Second thing I'll say, is that on the presenting one-sided information, one of the probably more successful actually activist engagements was with the Coalition on Public Protection, which we helped advocate and draft and pass, or help advocate for the commission to pass an ordinance to oversee police surveillance in the city of Dayton. And as part of the requirements to that, the city of Dayton has to, the police department actually has to do certain things that by law they have to follow before they introduce the police surveillance technology. They have to present an impact report in which they actually don't present just a one-sided thing. And they have to do annual reports on surveillance technology used in the city. And I can tell you that so far, even with a law that requires that they present a balanced view, I have not seen a single report, impact report, or annual report. The annual report of 2021, we sent back 3 times because of the problems, including that they did not want to report the dead end deployments of ShotSpotter because it falls under surveillance technology. They would write it just with the amount of arrests that ShotSpotter led to or something, or supported. And they had the data because we had collected the public records. They have the data on dead end deployments for the city of Dayton, but they would not report it. And I personally wrote a section for them with the data that they had, and they still did not include it in the report. So the challenges of this is so ingrained that it's really hard, even when you have passed a law that requires they do it. And because, anyways, I'll stop here because I could go on this for hours. So.
Not necessarily a question, but I was just more curious out there. Is it like an opportunity within our program?
Oh, and actually, I think that was a part of the question you asked, right? How the program could support. Yeah.
Do you see an opportunity or potentially even an issue within our program, like lack of activism, or just curious, like how did you take that first step in being active?
I mean,
that's like a big step for people.
I would love to see more, engagement with, I think like we're talking about the, participating councils and again, I would love if it was, I understand that, historically, it's not really like part of what the program responsibilities are, but I definitely think there would be a benefit to, things like engaging with the press too. Like sometimes the press, there's technology like this and having the human factors community actually review. And again, and I think what's important is to do it from not just from the perspective of the police and supporting police officers, but also trying to look at the bigger system and trying to, you know, provide a lens of what's providing safety. And I think I would strongly encourage, you know, anyone to, like, when you see articles on topics that you know something about, that reach out to the press. When if you can engage with your board, like with your councils and stuff, I think you'll probably see a lot of what we're talking about of those presentations, and how, and you'll quickly realize how little science and data play a role in public policy that impacts all of us and impacts all of our lives. And I think we have, you know, skills we can contribute to improve that. But at the same time, I mean, it's a little thankless job. So, so I think it'd be great if the program encourages that public engagement. I would love that.
So,
Yeah.
Follow up briefly. So that's you know, well taken. Good point. Should definitely. But what about corporations? So public institutions, that's great. Corporate responsibility. What about mile two, where you're now?
Mhm.
They do activism. Should they do, or should they stay?
I think corporations in general, including Mal, to do some, you know, some community, like, you know, like social, you know, engagements and things like that. So answering your question, I mean, I definitely see the argument for private corporations, for the responsibility of private corporations in general, as a much harder argument to make than the responsibility for public servants to serve the public. So it's not that I don't think, you know, there is obviously room for corporations to do that. I think there is definitely social enterprises and ways to, like, build corporations for public good. And I think what boggles my mind is seeing public organizations that are disregarding the public. So for me, like, to think that I'm going to reach a corporation, which, you know, I can see how a private corporation can really technically doesn't have the responsibility in my eyes. I mean, I would love for them to do more, and if I can advocate or persuade for companies like Mount to do more, and I think they do some. But I mean, I think, you know, like, there's always more you can do, of course. I just personally find the area of public organizations much more infuriating and much more like a much easier argument to make. You know, I mean, the fact that cities and counties and, you know, local jurisdictions don't do it, I find an opportunity to point it out, expose that. And usually there is actually a response from them, because they are publicly saying that they are there to listen to the public. Corporations oftentimes don't. I mean, they might have a little bit of a marketing, you know, like, aspect of it, but I don't think it's as much of the responsibility of corporations personally. I mean, if we can now get public organizations to really, like, serve the public, I think, like, I find targeting private corporations as a very, like, lofty goal, you know. So I wouldn't focus my efforts on that personally, but yet.
Yeah, so I can see that point. And, you know, a lot of people in the business world have that kind of position. They say business of business is business. There are other social goals and things like that. But if you think about how much power they have, they benefit from the public. They sell their things, they advertise things to the public, and arguably they exploit the public.
Mhm.
Should have some responsibility.
I
think it's more infuriating
I agree.
when you see governments not doing their job. But to just let the companies think that their business is just to do business and not care about the public, I think that's
I mean,
questionable.
yeah, I mean, I'm more prioritizing and thinking which one. I mean, like, if I'm able to, if we are able to impact more how the public organizations operate. First of all, it takes some power away from corporations already, but then I think, you know, I would be more inclined to focus on private corporations. But I wouldn't start there, like personally.
Officials have, like, it's a misdemeanor if they have non-feasance or misfeasance
Right.
or any other, like, they're legally required to act. And even though in Ohio, there's not the standard of data in other places, that's Ohio. It's not a skill set they teach, it's not.
I mean, I think it's a both and though. I mean, I'm not like saying I think I hope there's people who are working on that end too, because we need both.
Yeah.
I just personally I find much more compelling. I find like I can do a much more compelling job or much more effective job on the public side, because I think some of my small successes, which of course they're all small in the grand scheme of things, have been about framing problems and exposing systems and exposing some of the hypocrisy in the public, because the public organizations have a responsibility. Like they are supposed to be serving that, like that's their primary goal. So when you expose or highlight how they are intentionally not doing that, they have no choice but to, you know, address the conflict. With a corporation, that wouldn't necessarily work. They can always say, well, a private business, you know, I have the right to do this, and I'll be like, oh, yeah, you have the right to do that. So the argument is just harder for me to make.
I think so public entities can be held accountable, and people can lose their jobs because they didn't do something, or, you know, they wouldn't follow that. That's not going to happen in the private sector. I sort of think in the private sector, I think you're correct in that, you know, large companies can have a lot of power. And if they, you know, do, you know, take up an issue that is in line with that would be great, and it would be a good example. I sort of think that obviously that rests upon who's running a company. And, you know, I could see selling the idea to a company. You can convince them that by doing this, it will actually improve their lot in this capitalistic scheme of things, right? So it's sort of, you know, maybe electric cars is one of them, right? You know, although that hasn't all been thought through because we don't have enough power generation to actually support purely electric cars. But, you know, they can say, hey, you know, we're building these great cars and they're better on the environment, except for places that burn coal to generate electricity. And so they can get some mileage out of, you know, sort of being that, you know, sort of advocating and doing things that might give them an advantage over another company. If you can convince them that that's true, then they may very well take it up. But I think, you know, too many companies are just looking at the bottom line. And so you may convince them of that. If that doesn't pan out, then that's going to get dropped, right? But I think you're right in that big companies can carry a lot of weight, not only with the public, but also in influencing other companies to, you know, be that, you know, if you want kind of consumer confidence, that's one way you could get it.
They also have power over public institutions.
They do.
Lobbying and-
Yeah, lobbies have a ton.
Yeah.
Changes, especially social changes, were done because of subsidies, government requirements to change their threshold.
Like California be illegal to sell gasoline powered cars by 2035. Nowhere gasoline will be sold in California.
Yeah. I think we're out of time.
Yep.
I don't know.
It's good.
And this is my contact. Well, my contact is in the slide that you cannot see, but
no.
oh, it is there. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Actually, Jan was
right.
in the background.
So feel free to reach out if you would like to talk about any of this or something else
When we going to see you again?
soon.
My perpetual.
No, I actually,